Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Carter. I'm the Head of Collections here at St Paul's. I'd like to welcome you this afternoon to the first of our Collections Department lunchtime talks for 2015. Those of you who came to our talks last year will know that their purpose or what we do with the talks is take an aspect of the Cathedral's historic collections and use them as a springboard to explore the wider life and work of the Cathedral and the heritage of the Christian faith. And today's talk really is inspired by one of the most important parts of the collection, which is a group of about 2,000 books which were donated to the Cathedral and arrived in 1715, so 300 years ago this year. And we're very fortunate in that to commemorate the donation of these books and also the person who donated them, Bishop Henry Compton. We're very lucky in that the current Bishop of London, the Right Reverend Richard Chartres, is here to talk about his illustrious predecessor. There'll be the talk about 40 minutes and then time for a couple of questions at the end. But we also have some items from Bishop Henry's collection in a case in the room at the back, which you'll be able to enjoy afterwards. But without further ado, I'd like you to give the Bishop a round of applause and a warm welcome. Thank you.
Simon, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for your thoughtfulness in providing this marvellous backcloth. Here we have a portrait of the good bishop himself. There over the fire and presiding, as Simon has said, over quite a large part of his collection. So, the 300th anniversary of the arrival of a large part, some 2,000 volumes, of Bishop Compton's library, installed in the newly finished St Paul's Cathedral on July the 11th, 1715. That was when his will, of course, had been finally proved. He died in 1713. And the books still form a very important part of the collection. And there we can see the bishop's portrait hanging in the library. And this morning, I want to offer a complimentary sketch, a word picture. Henry Compton was the 108th Bishop of London, appointed in 1675, at a time when, of course, St Paul's itself was still a ruin. He was, and I'm afraid this is only too contemporary a point, he was very much involved in the fundraising in particular, and when he died after enormous fundraising exertions, when he died after 38 years in office in 1713, St Paul's was completed in all its glory. Now, the church in the 17th century offered one of the ways in which clever boys from humble circumstances could elevate their station in life. Notoriously, William Laud, that Archbishop of Canterbury, who seemed to have a gift of getting up people's noses, was the son of a clothier from Reading, and there was a good deal of snobbery in the opposition which Laud attracted from the nobly born who dominated secular affairs. Laud's route to power was via the University of Oxford and his eminence as a scholar. There is at least one of his works in Compton's benefaction, but Compton himself, his own background, was very different, because he was the sixth son of an earl, and his boyhood was marked by alarms and excursions, by the violence of the Civil War. Compton was not yet 11 when he was actually present in King Charles's camp at the Battle of Edge Hill in 1642, and his father, Spencer Compton, the second Earl of Northampton, participated at that battle in Prince Rupert's cavalry charge, together with 4 of Henry's elder brothers. His father's death, the Earl's subsequent death in battle in March 1643, left Henry at quite a young age an orphan, and with his birthplace, he was born at Compton Wynyates, if you know that wonderful house, his birthplace occupied by parliamentary forces. Quite where the family settled in these turbulent years is very uncertain, and they were very turbulent for the Church of England. In 1645, bishops and the Book of Common Prayer were abolished. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the said William Laud, was beheaded on Tower Hill. I had the melancholy duty 350 years after Laud's execution of delivering the sermon which he preached on that occasion in January 1645. And one of the yeoman warders of the Tower at that time was called Strafford. And so his pals said, "You march up and down Strafford, add a bit of sort of colour to the scene." And so 1645, the Archbishop was beheaded, and then 4 years later, on January the 30th, which we've just observed in this cathedral church, we've just observed in a church which actually has communion silver commissioned by Bishop Juxon under the Commonwealth, the King himself was executed in Whitehall. And the Bishop of London of the day, William Juxon, who'd served as Lord Treasurer of England during the period of Charles's personal rule, but who seemed to have, rather unlike Laud, the ability not to get up people's noses. He was at Charles's side on the scaffold, and he received the King's last word, which was, "Remember." We know that at the age of 20, Henry Compton was given leave to travel abroad. But he was back in England in December 1654 when he matriculated at Queen's College, Oxford. There's no record, however, of his taking a degree, which was not unusual for noblemen in those days. And despite his formidable collection of books, and Simon very kindly sent me a short title catalogue of the benefaction, despite the formidable collection of books, especially strong in patristic texts in the original languages, he never really developed as a serious scholar. Instead, he spent much of the period of the Commonwealth and the dictatorship of Cromwell travelling on the continent of Europe like so many other royalists. A friend later said of these years, and I think this illustrates something of Compton's character. A friend said of these years, "He spent some years in travelling, not to suck in the maxims of foreign states or to try the vices of foreign courts. He observed and examined the civil and ecclesiastical polities abroad. He made them his study, but not his rule. The more he stayed in France and Italy, the more Englishman he was." There's nothing like travel for narrowing the mind. During this period, Compton seems to have become a soldier. It was said that he trailed a pike in Flanders. And he also, for some reason which is obscure, he developed a visceral loathing of Roman Catholicism, which later in his career caused him to commit treason against the son of the king for whom his father had died. The list of books from the Compton benefaction supplied by Simon Carter illustrates the bishop's command of languages as a result of his travels. He was himself the author of a translation from the Italian of the life of Donna Olympia Maldaccini, the woman who allegedly pulled the strings during the pontificate of Innocent X, which was 1644 to 55. This book was published in 1667, and 2 years later Compton published a volume on Jesuits' intrigues, translated this time from the French. These rare anonymous works don't seem to have been included in his benefaction to St. Paul's, but I may be wrong there, and Joe is here and will be able to brief us on that point. Henry returned to England at the Restoration, although he was the only one of his surviving brothers not to sit in the Parliament of 1661. That year, he became a cornet in the Royal Horse Guards, and without resigning his commission, he was admitted as an MA at the University of Cambridge, although how he did this without a preliminary degree is very unclear, but it was a time of turbulence and confusion. He then did a 6-month stint in Tangier, which had been acquired by the crown as part of the dowry of Catherine of Braganza, Charles II's wife. He continued to be peripatetic. He didn't progress very far in his military career, but it certainly left its mark on him. James II complained that Compton was in the habit of speaking, and I quote the king, more like a colonel than a bishop. He certainly used military metaphors when addressing the clergy, and most notoriously he was the last bishop in England to buckle on a sword and put himself at the head of an armed and mounted troop in the crisis of 1688. In 1666, however, he was back in Oxford, this time at Christ Church, and he decided to be ordained. As the brother of an earl, he didn't have to wait long for preferment, and in 1667 he was installed as Master of St. Cross Hospital in Winchester, which some of you may know. It was a position which commanded the princely stipend of £500 an annum. Very, very considerable sum of money for the time. But Compton, as an enthusiastic builder, a generous host, and evidence of his activity at St. Cross survives in the outer gateway and the infirmary. Nevertheless, he was always short of money. His modern biographer, Edward Carpenter, sometime the Dean of Westminster, remarks that, quotes, a generous inclination to help the poor was always one of his most endearing characteristics. And of course that was expected. Personal hospitality and benefactions of that kind were expected of the episcopate in the 17th century. His charities, however, often landed him in debt, despite his substantial income. In 1669, he was made sub-dean of Christ Church in Oxford, and he proceeded to the degree of Doctor of Divinity, without, it seems, any very taxing preliminaries. Compton was not an original thinker. He wasn't a profound scholar, and John Evelyn, the diarist, hearing him preach in 1673, wrote, quotes, "This worthy person's talent is not preaching, but he is like to make a grave and serious divine." Not one of Compton's sermons was published in his lifetime, nor were any of them collected after his death, and that's a very unusual distinction at the time for such a prominent ecclesiastic. His charges, however, and reports of his conferences with the clergy do survive. They show a man of shrewd common sense who didn't affect the guise of a scholar, but rather emphasized the significance of religion for human conduct, and he was also indefatigable in rallying the clergy to the defence of the Church of England and the Restoration settlement. He was a stickler for discipline. Perhaps his military background comes out there as well, but he shows a marked lack of interest in theological discussion for its own sake. In 1674, Compton was nominated to the See of Oxford. But alas, with an annual income of £343, 7 shillings, 1 penny and a farthing, I have to say a farthing, which modern keyboards do not recognise, this bishopric, and this is what was said by a contemporary, this bishopric of Oxford was by much too narrow for his liberal and charitable hands. So he was in debt again, but he didn't have long to wait for relief, since in under 12 months he was appointed to London. His patron was the anti-French Chief Minister, the Earl of Danby, who at first secured for Compton the influential office of Dean of the Chapel Royal. I'm also Dean of the Chapel Royal, and it's an office which has been annexed to the See of London since the middle of the 18th century. But in Compton's day, it was quite a separate office and didn't automatically go with London. But it was an office which gave Compton considerable influence, and notably influence on the education of the young princesses, the daughters of James, Duke of York, Mary and Anne. And as Bishop of London, Compton was very much concerned with their education, and he was to confirm them both, and as we shall see, to marry them both. Humphrey Henchman, the 107th Bishop of London, died in October 1675 at the age of 82. He, unfortunately, in the time of the Great Fire of London, had compassed a PR disaster of some magnitude. Because, of course, you'll remember that in 1666 there was really no insurance. So if you were responsible for some institution, say St Bartholomew's Hospital, which survived on rents, which you collected from the various properties you owned in the City of London, what did you do after the whole city was devastated by the fire? Well, Henchman, who had similar obligations to other institutions, unfortunately sent out his rent demands. They landed on the singed doorsteps of properties which had been entirely destroyed, and merchants and other citizens who received these rent demands didn't take kindly to the bishop's initiative, and Henchman, as a consequence, had a very bad fire. But he died finally, aged 82, in October 1675, and the king confirmed the appointment of the Dean of the Chapel Royal, Henry Compton, on December the 13th of that year. And then the following year, the Earl of Danby put him in charge of a really rather fascinating religious census, which was designed by the chief minister to support an emphatic policy of support for the Church of England by demonstrating that the numbers of nonconformists, both Protestant dissenters and Roman Catholics, had been exaggerated. So the whole process is very suspect, but it's very interesting that in the Diocese of London there were supposed to be 263,385 conformists, 2,089 Protestant dissenting nonconformists, and 2,069 Roman Catholics. So in the Diocese of London there were small but very significant groups who dissented from the established church. And Roman Catholics in particular were in a very strong position at court. And Danby, as the chief minister, seeking to secure a Protestant succession for the future, was very worried about this situation. And that's why he had William of Orange invited to England in 1677, and Compton married him to the Princess Mary. And after Lord Hardwicke's Marriage Act of the middle years of the 18th century, you know you're only allowed to marry people between sunlight and sundown. You shouldn't marry people after 5 o'clock at night, and that dates from the 18th century after some scandals where brides had been under pressure to get married. But the habits in the 1670s were very different, because the marriage of Mary to William of Orange took place in Mary's bedroom at 9 o'clock in the evening of November the 4th, 1677, which was William of Orange's birthday. Now, all this activity earned Compton the implacable hostility of the Duke of York. You can imagine what a conscientious Roman Catholic thought about this fire-breathing Protestant bishop being in charge of the education of his daughters. And when Archbishop Sheldon died at the end of that year, 1677, James was determined to convince his brother, the king, King Charles, that anyone should be archbishop other than the Bishop of London. And in the event, William Sancroft, Dean of this cathedral church, Dean of St Paul's, newly installed in the house which I now occupy, the old deanery just across the road, he was appointed. It's very important to remember that as we move forward to the 1680s, the French monarchy, embodied by the Sun King Louis XIV, represented the most efficient modern form of government. promising security, law and order for a country still recovering, in the case of France, from the Fronde, or in the case of England, from the Civil War. And you know, in our country, the Civil War claimed as victims a greater proportion of the male population than was slain in World War I. So the Civil War was immensely destructive. And as you can imagine, one of the anxieties of people was that we should not return to the chaos of the Civil War. Parliaments, we perhaps read this time rather differently. Parliaments were then, by many people, seen as relics of a chaotic and feudal past, and they were disappearing all over Europe. The prestige of the French monarchy also seemed to support the idea that Catholicism, perhaps in its Gallican form, because of course the Pope was very hostile to Louis XIV and his ambitions, that Catholicism, perhaps in its national French Gallican form, provided the ideal ideological basis for the new style regime, the new modern regime. James, Duke of York, a restless reformer with considerable administrative abilities and moral qualities, succeeded his brother Charles in 1685, determined to remodel the state along French lines. After easily crushing a Protestant rebellion raised by Charles's bastard son, the Duke of Monmouth in the West Country, a movement which threatened to return England to the chaos of civil war, and that alarmed the possessing classes, James set about a concerted and highly successful campaign to insert Catholic allies in strategic offices in the city, the army, the universities. The king was intelligent and hard-working, although somewhat lacking in tact, and it's very important to recognise how powerful his position was and how close his royal revolution came to success. Much of the Church of England, traumatised by the Civil War, led by the pacific Archbishop Sancroft, taught a doctrine of non-resistance to royal authority, a doctrine developed as the crisis had gathered head under Charles I. Compton had a more militant disposition. He was anyway personally obnoxious to the new king, who wasted no time before dismissing him from the Privy Council in December 1685. And the following year, the king sought to muzzle all criticism of Catholicism from the pulpit, and his ire descended especially on the rector of St. Giles in the Fields, John Sharp, later Archbishop of York. St. Giles in the Fields, which still exists, that's where the Archdeacon of Charing Cross is the rector. The Bishop of London was ordered directly by the new king, James, to suspend Sharp on a very flimsy legal basis. And although Compton endeavoured to find a compromise, the king, using his newly appointed ecclesiastical commission, chaired by none other than Judge Jeffreys, had him suspended from office. And that case revolved around the crucial question, which was the central question of the period, whether the royal supremacy in the church, for example, was a personal supremacy or one defined by law passed by Parliament. It was the question which ultimately led James into exile and brought his son-in-law, William, to the throne of England. John Evelyn, the diarist, wrote that the affair of the Bishop of London was universally resented, and Compton's prestige as a Protestant martyr increased. And he took, 1686, he took gardening leave, but in his case, literally. This was the period when he was able to stock his gardens at Fulham with, I quote, new varieties of domestic and exotic plants, and under the dynamic leadership of the new Fulham Palace Trust, there is a campaign to restore the gardens at Fulham and to re-establish some of those varieties, including Bishop's Thumb, a species of pear noted by John Evelyn on his visit to Compton's garden. And while Compton was gardening, the king continued to drive forward his revolution. He assembled an army of 14,000 on Hounslow Heath. He made a determined attempt to Catholicise the leadership of the University of Oxford and to fill posts in the central administration, like that of Lord Treasurer, with co-religionists. In April 1688, the king announced a declaration of indulgence which dispensed with religious tests for admission to office in church or state. And he ordered that this declaration should be read from the pulpits of the London churches on 2 successive Sundays in May 1688 and in the rest of the country in June. Everybody saw what was happening and what was intended, and there was widespread resistance. 7 bishops were sent to the Tower, led by the Archbishop of Canterbury, not including Compton because he was already suspended for refusing the royal command. I think it's probably one of the very few times, bishops have never really been great popular figures in England, and I think that this was probably the only occasion when they were wildly popular with the London crowd. The banks of the Thames were filled with cheering citizens as the 7 bishops were rowed to the Tower for their refusal of the royal command. They were tried in Westminster Hall in one of the great set-piece show trials of the age on June the 29th, and it was a show trial that went wrong. Despite intense pressure from the court, they were acquitted amid scenes of indescribable enthusiasm. One of the members of the jury was the royal brewer, and he recorded that he was in a very invidious position because if he voted for their acquittal, he would cease to be the royal brewer, and if he voted for their condemnation, he would not be brewing for anyone else. So it was a very difficult time for him, but the jury acquitted them. And the same day as this happened in Westminster Hall, the Admiral of the Fleet, Arthur Herbert, stole out of the City of London, dressed as a common seaman, carrying a letter inviting William of Orange to intervene. It was a treasonable proposal, but with the birth of a Stuart male heir earlier that month in June, the conspirators believed that they had no time to lose. Astonishingly, among the 7 signatories was the signature of Henry Compton. He was the only bishop to sign the invitation, which caused William to land at Torbay on November the 5th. James marched off to Salisbury to confront the invaders, but after a number of significant defections, notably those of Sir John Churchill, later the Duke of Marlborough, and George, Prince of Denmark, the husband of the Princess Anne, the king returned to London in haste, only to find that his daughter Anne had been spirited away by her erstwhile tutor, the Bishop of London. Overnight she was lodged in Aldersgate, which was the city home of the Bishop of London at this point. It's still called London House. It's just opposite the Museum of London, and you must imagine a very sort of tense scene as Anne was smuggled out of her lodgings, spent one night there in the bishop's house, and then they galloped off together up the Great North Road. Compton, Bishop of London, armed with sword and pistols, escorting the princess out of the capital. They arrived in Nottingham and eventually entered Oxford, the bishop in a blue cloak at the head of 500 horsemen with his cornet bearing a standard on which was written in gold letters, Nolumus leges Angliae mutare. We are unwilling that the laws of England should be changed. Odo of Bayeux would have approved, but this was not the conduct expected of a 17th century bishop. and Compton's reputation was irreparably damaged. Nevertheless, in April 1689, it was Compton who presided at the coronation of William and Mary, having revised the order used for James II and restoring, for example, the Eucharist. It might have been expected, given his exertions for the cause, that Compton would have been the obvious successor for Sancroft at Lambeth, when the latter refused to take the oaths of allegiance to the new regime. But in the event, he was passed over again in favour of the newly appointed Dean of St Paul's, John Tillotson. And Tillotson was consecrated on Whitsunday, 1691, in St Mary-le-Bow, just down the road. Compton did not attend and was bitterly disappointed. He remained under a cloud for the whole of William's reign, but returned to favour with the accession of Queen Anne in 1702, when the bishop, you must remember, was already 70. Retirement age now, but not then. The story so far has been dominated by high politics, but Compton was also an exceptionally energetic diocesan bishop. He interested himself in the plight of refugees from the religious conflicts on the continent. He showed an especial sympathy with the sufferings of the Greek Orthodox Church under Turkish rule. He knew something about the Oriental churches as well. There is a volume dedicated to a description of Nestorianism in the books he gave to St Paul's Library. He was also, as the bishop continues to be, the visitor of St Paul's, and he came here for a very lengthy visitation in the 1690s to reform abuses in the rebuilt cathedral. And he was also active overseas, so he was immensely energetic. The jurisdiction in the plantations in America, which absorbed quite a bit of his time and attention, was one which Henry Compton inherited when he became bishop in 1675. It had murky origins and a very slender legal basis. Seems to have originated with Laud's attempts to extend the establishment of the Church of England to every part of the globe where English government had a foothold. Examining the Bishop of London's archive of papers, which survive in great profusion, the papers relating to church affairs in the Americas, it's clear that Compton's assiduity and longevity in office consolidated and enhanced the link between London and the embryo Anglican Church on the American continent. He was a member of the committee which was responsible for American affairs, the Lords of Trade and the Plantations, and so was able to exercise influence on the governors and the administrations of the various colonies. Colonization of the American East Coast had been piecemeal and spasmodic. Each state had its own history and presented its own problems. In 1679, when Compton did a survey, there were only 4 Church of England clergy in North America outside the states of Virginia and Maryland. And on the whole, things were very much better in the West Indies. Communication was, of course, a very large problem. A reply to a letter sent in January from the bishop's country seat in Fulham Palace took at least 6 months and wouldn't arrive until July at the earliest. But despite these difficulties, the Fulham archive reveals a great deal of activity in response to the challenges of a world very different from London. One of Compton's earliest recommendations to the Lords of Trade and the Plantations was that a commissary should be appointed under the various governors to exercise ecclesiastical jurisdiction. And one of the first commissaries was destined to become one of Compton's most significant collaborators, Thomas Bray, who was a commissary in the New World, but eventually became rector of St Botolph's Aldgate here in the City of London. The prayer book and its system is at the heart of the spiritual identity of the Anglican Church, and Compton and Bray set about making it better known in America through the work of the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, which still exists, whose foundation was directly inspired by the missionary needs of the New World. And one of SPCK's primary tasks was to translate the prayer book into more than 200 languages. And the first edition of the prayer book printed in America was during Compton's episcopate in 1710, and it was followed soon after by a translation of the Book of Common Prayer into Mohawk. And the church did indeed expand in states beyond Virginia and Maryland. There is, for example, preserved a marvellously engrossed act of the South Carolina Assembly of 1706, establishing worship according to the Book of Common Prayer and dividing the colony into parishes. Rectors there were to be elected by parishioners, and from this flows part of the distinctive ethos of the Episcopal Church in the US. In England, by contrast, there were only a tiny handful of parishes left over from the Commonwealth in which there was an element of popular election. One example is St James's Clerkenwell in this diocese, where the election of a new rector throughout the 18th century was always the occasion for serious rioting. It was one of the very few opportunities to demonstrate the democratic will. For the rest, the patronage system put power into the hands of lay notables, Oxbridge colleges, bishops and deans. Also in America, a further act provided for the establishment of free schools with an Anglican schoolmaster, and this paralleled contemporary developments which Compton encouraged in England, where very large numbers of schools for the poor were being founded. Compton also promoted the idea of establishing bishops in America itself. There had been plans to send a bishop to Virginia, but there was a failure to raise an endowment. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, with Compton's enthusiastic support, launched a campaign to appoint a bishop for America in 1704. And part of the idea was to use some of the vacant suffragan sees created as part of a discontinued Tudor experiment for the service of the church overseas. And that would have led to the bizarre result of the bishops of Colchester and Dover serving in the American plantations. Any attempt, of course, to set up, and Compton realised this, any kind of what he called absolute bishop would cause great alarm. At the time needed, and the sort of bishop needed in America, according to Compton, was one who had all necessary power to restrain vice and keep good order, but no more. He would have the powers of the commissaries, but with the added ability to consecrate churches, to confirm and to ordain. It was rumoured, and this is a fascinating what might have been story. You know that the person who was being touted as the very first Bishop of Virginia was none other than Jonathan Swift. And SPG, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, actually started negotiations in 1711 for the purchase of a bishop's house in America. But the Hanoverian succession put a temporary halt to this campaign. Compton was over 80 by this time, but his appetite for business hardly slackened. He continued to find relaxation in botany, and the gardens of Fulham Palace were enriched with many American species which were first indigenized in Europe in the Bishop of London's garden. There is a very useful history of the American links of the garden among the publications available from Fulham Palace itself. There is an account, for example, of a box of South Carolina products sent over by one Mr. Stevens being received at Fulham. And as part of the educational programme for young visitors to the palace, we're hoping to recreate this box to illustrate the importance of the garden in the history of what has been called the golden age of botany. And it was at Fulham that the bishop was laid to rest. He was laid to rest in the churchyard, aged in 1713, 81. He ordered that his tomb should not bear any of the eulogistic inscriptions common in that age. Instead, it should bear simply his name, his age, the date of his birth, and an inscription in Greek, only in the cross. Compton was not an original theologian or a great preacher. He did not himself produce any of those massive tomes of divinity which he donated under the terms of his will, but he was an indefatigable missionary bishop whose legacy, like the books he left to the Cathedral, lives on. Thank you very much.